The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. We're up to Unit 3 today, so welcome wherever you are. The normal process is when you've got any questions or any comments you'd like to make, any observations, just go to the right-hand side. If there's a little red tick there, you open that up and go to the question box and type in your question. Now, when you do that, of course, I get to see the answer straight away, so I'll respond to it as soon as I can. And that way we keep this thing highly interactive. So welcome wherever you are. We've got a big audience online today, which is great. And we're into an interesting topic again today, which is around managing emotions in conflict situations. Now, one of the reasons that many people have difficulty with conflict is the emotional connection that goes with the conflict. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit around some of the strategies you can use perhaps to just temper that emotional reaction. So for example, if you're sitting in a room and your boss has a go at you, you weren't expecting it, but all of a sudden you freeze and you have this panic feeling, you're going to be feeling very reluctant to perhaps assert your, defend yourself and assert yourself in that situation. Or on another occasion, somebody might be yelling and screaming at you and you feel the blood going to your head and you overreact, and of course you're over aggressive. So these sorts of things do impact our capacity to deal with conflict effectively. Now, the important thing here that we need to realize is that just 1 hour webinar today, we're not going to fix all that. But what I'm hoping to do is to give you some awareness strategies that will help you so that you can minimize those emotional reactions. So that's really what we're on about today, because we know it's a very important topic, of course. So just before we launch into the topic, you may recall 2 weeks ago we looked at the four personality types, and there was a profile online that you could do, and I hope you've had a chance to do that. I know some of you have, and you've communicated with me between sessions. But ultimately what it was talking about was the connection between personality and conflict resolution styles. So it was about giving you a little bit of insight into the way people like to deal with conflict, and that was what that was all about. So I hope you found that useful. So today, let's launch into the topic of managing emotions in conflict situations. So there's 3 things that I'd like to cover today. Basically, just let's try and understand stress. So what is stress? And of course, the world we're living in at the moment is highly charged with stress. And let's understand what all that means, because usually in a conflict situation, it's a stressful situation, and and then your reaction to that emotionally will have an impact on your capacity to deal with that. So let's look at the concept of stress to start with. And of course, what that means is that ultimately we've got to be able to self-regulate. Now, self-regulation, of course, and I'll give a definition shortly about that, is that capacity to be able to manage your own emotional response to a situation. And I'll talk around that and some strategies around that. And then, as I said at the end, I'm going to talk about some strategies in reducing stress levels, because ultimately it's about being able to reduce those stress levels, which give you a better opportunity. I mean, how often have you walked away from a situation which was potentially a conflict situation and thought to yourself, oh, I should have said this, or I should have said that, or why didn't I do this, or why didn't I do that? We all have those reactions, and it's because we haven't been in the right space emotionally at the time to deal with it. So therefore, we didn't deal with it. We had what we might call an amygdala hijack, and ultimately we walk away and we probably didn't deal with it as effectively as we possibly could. So they're the 3 things we're covering today. So as I said, anytime you've got questions or comments, please post them in the question box there, and I'll deal with them the moment I see them. All right, so look, a couple of things about stress. Now, obviously, stress is something that's manufactured in the mind. In fact, what I might think is stressful, you may not think is stressful. So in other words, the stress itself is a subjective phenomenon. In other words, it's our interpretation of things. Now you might say, well, if I'm attacked by a wild animal, that's stressful. Well, of course it is. But people will react in different ways to that circumstance. So stress is something that we create in our own mind. Now, I'm not saying we can eliminate all of that, and we can't, because it's a primitive response, of course. You've heard it before, the flight or fight response. It gets the adrenaline going and it gives us an opportunity to react. So some stress is actually a very good thing. In fact, to have some stress gives you the opportunity to perform at a high level. So we do need some degree of stress, but ultimately our stress is manufactured in our mind. That's important to understand, because we've all been in situations where somebody next to us is not stressed about the same circumstances that are happening to us, and you're more stressed than they are. How do you explain that? Well, it's about the manufacturing of that situation. It's the interpretation of that goes on in the mind. So, of course, stress means different things to different people. That's the truth of the matter. And, of course, as I said before, there are certain things that will stress you more than other things. And it's important to actually ask yourself the question, what are those things? Because clearly they're what we might call your hot buttons. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the webinar. So what stresses one people will challenge others. We've all seen Olympic athletes who basically are all set for the gold medal, and they've got that one jump to complete, and they fold. And then we might find someone else who we don't expect is going to achieve success and do, because they've actually taken the situation and built on it and thrived on what others might perceive to be a stressful situation. So we've all seen examples of that. So stress is critical to our capacity to deal with conflict. And as I said earlier, the truth of the matter is that we need some degree of stress in order to perform at a high level. And of course, if you take the issue of conflict or negotiation, where there's a difference of viewpoint between yourself and somebody else, being on edge to some degree is helpful. But obviously, if it goes too far, then it leads to poor performance. But it is necessary to have some stress in order for us to perform at a high level. But of course, when we're overstressed, that's where the problems occur. So now you may well have seen this chart before, but ultimately it's a very simple chart that basically says that over on the left-hand side, we've got low stress, and over on the right-hand side, we've got high stress, which we might call distress. And in the middle, we have eustress, which is optimum for performance. And you can see that we need some degree of stress in order to perform at a reasonably high level. So the problem with this chart that I'm showing you now is that for each of us, it'll be different. In other words, the hump will be in different spots, depending on our own interpretation of the world. But of course, what happens is we manufacture that in our mind. So we do need some stress in order to perform at a high level. And I'm sure you can think of examples where that is the case. But at other times, of course, too much stress leads to poor performance. And so when we're talking about conflict, and we might be talking about that from a performance perspective, too much stress can lead to a situation where you freeze, or you don't have the right words to say, or you might get angry and upset and go overboard and lose it, when in actual fact you realize later on you probably shouldn't do that. So we have varying degrees of stress in different situations. And if I just put this chart up there, you can see that if you have too little stress, it'll lead to boredom. If you have optimum stress, it will lead to optimum performance. And of course, you have a distress when too much stress is in play. So this is just giving you some background about some of the reasons why we worry or get upset or agitated and so forth. But remember, this is a mind game. This is what we manufacture in our head, It's not actually real. It's our interpretation of reality that leads to the stress rather than the reality itself. We tell ourselves it's reality, but it's actually an interpretation of what reality really is. So just taking that a step further, and if you look at this chart here, it just shows you the kind of different reactions. So, if we have excessive stress in a situation that we happen to be in, it's obviously going to lead to poor performance, dysfunctional behavior. It'll actually lead to health problems and all the rest of it. All right. But with moderate stress, of course, it leads to high performance and job satisfaction, engagement, optimum performance, and so forth. And too little stress, interesting enough, is just as bad as too much stress because it leads to poor performance and dysfunctional behavior and health problems and so on. So stress levels are critically important when it comes to dealing with situations of conflict. So too little or too much means that we're probably not going to be at our best when we have to present in a conflict situation. So let's talk about self-regulation. So if we put aside that stress, if we talk about the concept of self-regulation, what are we actually talking about when we talk about self-regulation? Well, self-regulation is the ability to monitor and control our own behavior, our emotions and thoughts, and altering them in response to the demands of the situation. So it's about regulating, and self-regulating is really critically important. It's an important component of what we might call emotional intelligence. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, people often think about how good are we at dealing with people. But there's two dimensions to emotional intelligence. There's the inner game and the outer game. The inner game is partly around awareness, understanding when you are stressed, and being able to regulate that so that we keep our calm under pressure. The outer game, of course, is being aware of other people and what they're doing and being able to respond accordingly. So getting good at being able to self-regulate is critically important to your success. Look, every one of us who are in this workshop today could think of an example where we perhaps didn't deal with the situation particularly well. We regret what we did. The problem sometimes when we think about those circumstances is we beat up on ourselves a second time. So the first time is when we overreacted. And then later on, when we think about it, we get angry with ourselves for overreacting. So it's kind of like a double whammy. So we need to learn to be able to self-regulate better. And all of us have got lessons to learn there. You have, I have, we all have. So how do we do that? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and give you some tools to do that. But self-regulation is critically important, is to take that split second before we might react to somebody else. Is often going to be the make or break situation. And I'll talk about that using some examples as well. So I mentioned the term amygdala hijack earlier, and if you think about the physiological responses to stress, what actually happens in the brain is interesting. So what happens is that we have a primitive part of our brain, which is what we might call the amygdala. Now, the amygdala has not changed at all in the course of human history. Since humans were humans, the amygdala is a part of our brain that pretty much is a primitive part of our brain that hasn't really been developed. And ultimately, its primary purpose is to react quickly when faced with a threat. So obviously, during cave times, one of the biggest stresses, in fact, probably the only major stress, was being attacked by a wild animal. And you've got two choices when you're attacked by a wild animal. You either run away, so if the animal is slow and big, then obviously the optimum thing to do is to run away. But if the animal is quick and fast, as small as well, the optimum response might be to fight. So this is what we call, of course, psychologists call the flight or fight response. So what happens is when some sort of a threat comes into our head, the first thing that we react to is the amygdala makes a very quick decision as to what to do without any logic, because of course moving quickly by being attacked by a wild animal is extremely important for survival purposes. So in our modern day, this amygdala is still activated and it's still working. So as I said before, if somebody shouts and screams at you in an unprovoked way, your amygdala will kick in and you will respond in one of two ways. You will either lash out at the other person indiscriminately and perhaps regret it later on, or you might decide to fold and allow that person to basically be aggressive towards you. Now that's the amygdala operating, and that's to save ourselves from physical attack. But obviously, where we are now in the workplace, being saved from physical attack is not something we need to worry too much about. It can still happen, of course, but we don't worry too much about it. So this will come into play very quickly. My best bit of advice to you is that what you've got to do is to be aware of it, and the moment you're put into a position of threat, you've got to slow down the response that goes to the amygdala. So what that means in plain English is we probably need to take a deep breath when those situations arise. Is to actually physically take a deep breath, because what happens physiologically when you're put under pressure is your breathing gets shallow. Now you don't know that, of course, because what happens is that you're just, you're focusing on the threat, but your breathing actually gets shallow. So there's two reasons why we need to take a deep breath. One reason, of course, is that we just need to get some oxygen into our system, because the fact is we've probably stopped breathing at that moment. But the second most important reason for doing that is that so we can then slow the pace of the threat to the amygdala so that we don't react in a flight or fight response. Because a flight or fight response isn't necessarily the right way to go in all conflict situations. So therefore, what we're doing is giving ourselves that short space of time where our rational mind comes into play to be able to make a decision about what to do or not to do in that situation. Okay? So my best advice to you is that when those sorts of circumstances happen, if you're sitting in a chair, you sit back, you take a deep breath for a split moment while you can process what's going on around you, so that you can then make a logical and rational response to the circumstances that are in play. But if you don't do that, then what's happening is you are not self-regulating, and you are then going to do something which is going to be a knee-jerk reaction, which is probably likely not to be seen to be an effective response to that situation. All right, so I know this is all background, but I think the first practical tool I would say to you here is to take that deep breath when you're put into a situation where you're basically confronted by somebody about something. That becomes really important. Okay, now Viktor Frankl wrote a great book called Man's Search for Meaning. Now, Viktor Frankl was a POW. Was somebody in a POW, was in a Nazi concentration camp, which I would imagine is about as stressful as you could probably get. And he wrote this book on how he survived in those circumstances. And he made a very interesting comment about that he said that there is nothing I can do about my surroundings. And we can't control if someone's going to yell at us necessarily. We can't control, all of these things that are going on around us. But we can control how we respond by the connection between what happens to us and how we respond. So it's that split second between that. So stress is a transaction between a stimulus and a response. So something happens, and then we've got a choice about how we respond. So there is a space in that momentary period where we can decide and choose how we react to that stimulus. And what Frankl was saying in his book is that that was the thing that got him through that traumatic experience, is to be able to make choices about how he could react to that. He couldn't choose what he could do about the stimulus, but what he could do is to choose how he reacted to that stimulus by that momentary transaction between the stimulus and the response, if that makes sense. So the transaction revolves around the appraisal of the potential stressor. It's based on two questions that we ask ourselves often. Is this a threat to me? And the second question that we ask is, can I cope? These are the two questions that we ask of ourselves. Now, if you take the deep breath, as I mentioned before, those two questions, we don't overreact to those two questions, because obviously if the answer is yes and no, then likely to create a stressful response. And a stressful response may lead to a poor choice as to how we might deal with it. So by taking the deep breath, we are disengaging the amygdala hijack, or the amygdala aspect of our brain, so that we're not hijacked as such, if that makes sense. Does anyone have any questions at this point they'd like to ask about this concept of stress and how we react to it? Please go to the question box. I will certainly do what I can to respond. I might also say I'm not a world expert on this topic. I think I self-regulate reasonably well. I occasionally make mistakes. I occasionally overreact. I occasionally allow my amygdala to take over. But I find that with more and more awareness and work and self-regulation, the less and less that occurs. And that is the critically important part. You've got work to do on yourself. So, the author's name is Viktor Frankl, and his book is entitled Man's Search for Meaning. It's one of the greatest bestsellers of all time, and I'm sure if you just Google that, you'll get plenty of references to it. But it is an interesting read. So thanks, Francesca. That would be the book. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about some strategies. Let's talk about some things that you can do that will prevent you from having what we might term an amygdala hijack. So when something stressful happens to you, you can use the three lens approach, and you can see the reference of the book at the bottom there if you're interested. Now, the three lens approach is that we can look at the situation in three ways. We can use what we might refer to as the reverse lens. Now, the reverse lens is, what would the other person in this conflict say, or in what ways might it be true? So in other words, we could actually, so this is something that's happened to you in the past, so we can sit there and reflect on that and try to make sense of the circumstances that we're in. Now, one of the best tools that I use, and I certainly suggest, and even my MBA students that I teach, I talk about using a journal, to actually write down, your response to the stressful situation. And what you're doing is essentially, it's not a Dear Diary situation. What you're doing is you're taking out of your head what happened to you, or what you think happened to you, and you're putting it on paper. And by doing that, it kind of gives you a little bit more objectivity to think about it. So you can look back on it and reflect on it and say, well, what did I learn from this? This is not an exercise in beating up on yourself and saying, I should have done this and I should have done that, but it's about learning from it. So that's one lens you can use. Now, the long lens I use a lot. I find this is very powerful. The long lens is, how will I most likely view this situation in 6 months? And 9 times out of 10, maybe even more than 9 times out of 10, it will be completely and utterly irrelevant. So another way of asking that question is, will this have any impact on me in 6 months? There's a reasonable chance it won't if you think about it rationally. In other words, we're in that moment, but what we can do is step back and think, well, is this going to make a huge difference in 6 months? Most of the time it's not going to, and so that in itself can be reassuring, because it's one of those things that we probably don't ask ourselves, and we think, well, we're going to be stressed or worried about this situation forever and a day, and that's not necessarily the case in most instances. Now, the wide lens is, regardless of the outcome, how can I grow and learn from this? Now, the wide lens is around, what did I learn from this situation that will be helpful for me in the future if and when I face a similar situation? Now, you might say, well, this is, it still happened to me and all the rest of it. But the point is, remember, stress is how you process things. And by using the 3-lens approach, you're taking a far better, more disciplined approach to dealing with the situation than you would be by sitting there and stewing about it or worrying about it and all the rest. So there's the 3-lens approach. It works very well. As I said to you, I use the long lens quite regularly. So when I'm stressed about something, I just think, well, what will this be like in 6 months? And I have to then admit to myself that it'll be gone. It'll be over with, and I'll be moving on to something else. I probably may not even remember it. Now, another approach you can use is called reframing. Now, reframing is changing the way you have actually interpreted a situation. So reframing, and I'll just go through this with you, reframing is seeing the current situation from a different perspective, which can alter the way you think about the stressor. All right, so it's actually consciously changing what you're telling yourself about the circumstances that you're in. So reframing can help you or another person to more constructively move on from the situation in which you're in and the other person feels stuck, overwhelmed, or confused. Now, let me give you a practical example. So let's say, for example, and remember, if you talk about the example of stimulus versus response, in the 2 diagrams there, you can see that what's on the left-hand side is the stimulus. So the external circumstances that you're in is that bad day at work and you've had an argument with your manager. All right? So that's what's happened. So you've had a big argument with your manager, you've had a rotten day at work. So that's the stimulus. It's just the way it is. It's happened. Now, how do I frame that? So at the top, you could say that my thought might be, out of that situation, I might think, well, she or he thinks that I'm useless. I can't seem to do anything right at the moment. So that's your frame. Now, if you had that frame in your head as a result of those circumstances, the feeling that you would get is, of course, you'd feel awful. You'd wish you could leave your job right now. I mean, you would have this terrible feeling about the circumstances that you're in, because that's the frame that you've told yourself. Remember, the frame you tell yourself is not real. It's just what you tell yourself. Now, on the other hand, if you simply shift your thoughts to this, so the same circumstances in the yellow have happened, you've had a bad day at work and you've had an argument with your boss. But this time you think, perhaps she is having a bad day. I know my work is not perfect, but there are merits to the work that I do. So I've taken an enormous amount of pressure off by telling myself that. Now, it's not a lie or an affirmation or anything like that. I am just reframing what's happened. So therefore, my feeling is going to be different. And that is, I'm okay. Perhaps this is a reminder that there's a better job out there that suits my skills, which is a far more constructive feeling than it would be to say, I feel awful, I wish I could leave my job right now. So the reframing is another tactic or strategy or tool that you can use when you're placed in that situation where you're stewing and stressing about something, you can actually reframe it and think about it differently. You have the capacity to do that. I don't know whether you've ever thought about that, but the frame that you tell yourself is something that you tell yourself. You've made that up. So equally, you can reframe that as well. That's not about, as I said, it's not about sugarcoating things, as you can see in the example there. I mean, the boss still yelled at you. I mean, that happened. That was the stimulus that occurred. But your response, which in this case is the feeling that you've got towards that, is dramatically different by the reframing what that means. And often what happens is we make generalizations. And when we make generalizations, that's a frame that's not constructive. So he's always angry, or she's always uncooperative. When we make those sorts of frames and assertions to ourselves, it just adds a huge amount. It creates what we might term learned helplessness, and it creates a problem for us. So stopping and thinking about how you can think about it differently can have a huge impact on how you process that. So if you've got any questions, folks, dive in. I'm keen to hear what you've got to say about this. Now, the other thing that we should be aware of is that a happy brain or a negative brain, a lot to do with that is what we tell ourselves. And the fact is, we tell ourselves a whole bunch of subjective things. We tell ourselves a whole bunch of lies. And a lot of what we tell ourselves is not based in any fact. So if we're telling ourselves things that are actually not true, we're still operating on the basis that they are true, because we've never stopped to ask ourselves whether they are true. So one of the things that you can do is to actually ask yourself whether something is true or not. So you can see there are 4 steps there. So step 1 might be, is it true? Is it true what I'm thinking? Is what I'm saying based on logic and reality? And then, of course, you can test it out a bit further and say, is it absolutely true? Is it 100% accurate? And how does this thought make me? So by that stage, you're getting to a stage of saying, no, it's just my reaction to something. It's not actually factually true. And this is where the generalizations come in. We say, oh, that person's a terrible person, or this person's always aggressive. Now, when we make those generalizations, they're not actually true. We might think they're true. Well, obviously, we do think they're true and we act accordingly. So the first thing is to interrogate that thought process, because it's not true. Someone can't always be aggressive. Someone can't always be a bad person. That's the reality of it. I'm sure there are circumstances where that is not true. But if we make that generalization and we don't stop to think, is this factually correct? Now, we're not letting people off the hook here. See, this is the important thing. We're not letting people off the hook for poor behavior, because at the end of the day, we are just putting our brain into a better position where we can deal with conflict in a more effective way. That's all we're trying to do here. So how's this thought make me feel, and what would things be like if I didn't hold this belief? Okay, so this is around awareness, stopping yourself swallowing things that are actually not true by testing it out, by asking whether or not they are true. That's a good starting point. So these are just mental tools for you and me to apply when we're faced with those difficult situations that we all face. So one of the things I would say to you that there's a great book that you might be interested in. The person's name is Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K, Carol Dweck, and the book is called Mindsets. And Carol Dweck talks about a concept called the growth mindset. It's a very simple but powerful concept. Her argument is that we can adopt either a growth mindset or a negative mindset depending on the circumstances that we're in. So she talks about two concepts, a growth mindset, and she argues that this is a far more powerful thing to have, and she talks about a fixed mindset, which is a mindset that where we're fixed and set in our ways. Now, each of us is both a product of having both a growth and a fixed mindset. And she talks about this in her book, and she really gives an interesting example. She talks about John McEnroe, the great tennis player. And I'm sure all of us have seen clips of him going off at the umpire when the umpire, adjudicates a point against him, and he goes off at the umpire. He's famous saying, "You can't be serious." Now, Carol Dweck argues that John McEnroe in those cases had a fixed mindset. In other words, he was thinking in those circumstances that the world is conspiring against me. And so he was blaming, in this case, the referee or whoever it was that he was having a go at. So a growth mindset is where we actually are open to a possibility of learning, whereas a fixed mindset is we are set in our ways. So if you have a look at these two examples on the screen there, so instead of saying, "I'm not good at this," so when you and I say, and we do say it, don't we, "I'm not good at this," that's a fixed mindset. So in other words, we've closed off any possibility that we will actually become good at it because we've already told ourselves that we're not good at it. It's much better to say something like, "What am I missing?" So what am I missing in order to improve on this, whatever it might be? Another thing is, "I give up," rather than saying, "I'll use a different strategy." See, if I say I'm going to give up, that's an absolute fixed mindset. If I said I'll use a different strategy, that opens up the possibility that there is a better strategy, and perhaps it may attempt me to use that as such. So Francis says, "Could you please advise what the book was called by Carol Dweck?" Yes, I thought I had a copy actually on my desk here somewhere, which I could almost show you. No, I don't. I don't think it's called Growth Mindset. I think it's called Mindsets, something along those lines. I think if you type in the word Carol Dweck, by the way, Francis, it's Dweck, right? Carol Dweck. So if you type that into Google, it'll come up and it'll have her book. It's her most famous book. It's a brilliant read, highly recommended. And I would have had a copy here, but I must have put it on back in the shelf. So that's what I would suggest you get hold of. Yeah, no worries. All right. So you have a situation where I can't make this any better. We've all told ourselves things like that, haven't we? What about if we said, I can always improve? You see the difference? Now, I don't want any of you to beat up on yourself and say, "Oh, I can see I've got a fixed mindset." It is impossible, which is a fixed mindset by just saying that, incidentally. Mindset, there you are. Nick has just given us the name, mindset. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate that. I didn't have the opportunity to do the same thing. Thanks, Nick. So and those of you who've got kids, this is a brilliant thing to teach your kids, that when they say make generalizations or clearly have fixed mindsets, stop them and provoke them to think differently about it. It's a great lesson to teach your kids. But the first thing you need to do is to make sure that you are aware when you're coming at a situation where you have a fixed mindset, and then be able to provoke and think, what's another way of thinking about this? Again, this is self-regulation. And so all of us are a combination of both. As I said before, I lecture in an MBA program at QUT, and and it's usually at the beginning of the MBA, the Master of Business Administration. And these postgraduate students, I'm sure some of you have got an MBA, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But at the early stage of their study, because they've been studying for years, and many of them mature age, most of them are, you can see this panic on their face, where they think, you can see that they're thinking to themselves, I'm not good enough for this, or I'm not going to get through. So having these mindsets and attitudes, there's no basis in reality about that. It's just what you're telling yourself, is leading to a situation of panic, which could, of course, lead to a situation where that person does panic and decide not to do the work that they should be doing, and ultimately does maybe fail. And then, of course, that creates what we might call a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then they say, ha, I was right all along. And it just creates an even stronger fixed mindset. So catch yourself and ask yourself, am I coming at this with a growth mindset, or am I coming at this situation with a fixed mindset, which is the key message there for you. So I'm not going to ask you to do this now, but what you might like to do as homework is, this idea of having a journal is really useful. I use a journal. I write things down at different times. In fact, I've got this, it's just nothing fancy about it. It's just a typical book, and I'll write notes in there. I might do my to-do list, and there's a whole range of other things, but the basic thing is I've got everything in one book. But sometimes if I've had a meeting and it's gone extremely well, or if it hasn't gone well, I'll use some of the strategies I'm sharing with you here today and start writing down some of my reactions to that, so that I can actually look at it slightly differently, so it can help me with my own self-regulation, because we all need to do that in order to improve that. So for example, I'll give you a really important example. If you think you're no good at dealing with conflict, is that a fixed mindset or a growth mindset? Well, obviously it's a fixed mindset. The fact of the matter is, if you've got two people on a desert island, there's going to be conflict at some point. So we can't avoid it. And that's, of course, why you're here. But if we're telling ourselves that we're hopeless at dealing with conflict, we are putting ourselves in a position where we can't really have what we talked about as a growth mindset. So that's a gross generalization. It's not correct, and it's going to stifle your capacity to deal with conflict situations when they arise. And of course, if you're a person who may avoid conflict and do everything you can to avoid it and do too much of that, after you avoid the conflict, you might say to yourself, I'm a coward, or I'm not courageous. Now, you say that, it's a generalization. It's not true, because I'm sure I could find examples in your life where you're not like that. So it's not actually true. So you're betting up on yourself, which is creating a fixed mindset, which is affecting your capacity to deal with those sort of circumstances differently in the future. You see how important this is. It's really, really important. It's called self-regulation. And that's why I wanted to do this before we got too far into the Lunch and Learn series, and give you a chance to really reflect on this. And in order to do that, you've got here 5 key questions that you can go straight away and ask yourself, because it's important. Let's go through them. I don't want you to answer them now, but you can just, these will be posted up on the learning platform. They are posted up on the learning platform, I think. I'll be dealing with that this afternoon. I'll send out an email, and I'll have the recording that we've got today as well. So what makes you angry? Another way of putting that is, what is your hot button? What are your hot buttons? It's important for you to be able to answer that. So when you lose it, What are those circumstances? So we're pinpointing those particular hot buttons. How do I typically react when I get angry? So people react differently in situations of anger. Some people will jump up and down and scream and yell. Other people will just quietly fume. We'll have all these different reactions to how we might deal with things. But how do you deal with it? What are you telling yourself while you're angry? That's, we've been spending a fair bit of time today talking about what are you telling yourself in those circumstances? Can you catch what you're saying to yourself about this? What personal values have been typically violated when you get angry? Now, I can tell you this for a fact, that when you identify what your hot buttons are, there is a direct relationship between that and your values. So in other words, when someone violates your values or value, that's when you're going to be at your most vulnerable, when you're not going to react in a certain way. Sorry, I just went too far there. I've just got a question here. So we have, I think it depends who you are having the conflict with as well. Janine, that's a good point, and your relationship with them. Yes, it's true. It depends on who it is and your relationship with them. But don't forget, you're also telling your story. You're telling yourself a story about that as well. All right. So, but you're 100% right. I agree with you. It does depend on who it is. But then you've got to ask yourself, why does it depend on who it is? In other words, you're carrying around some preconceived thoughts about the relationship and the other person. And what I'm asking you to do is to think about that a little bit deeper so that you can self-regulate better the next time that happens. Okay, but thank you. That's a good point that you make. So what are the personal values that are being violated? And then how long does it take for you to calm down? Do you fume about it for days, weeks, months, or are you able to calm down fairly quickly? Normally, when you sort of get very angry, it will take a serious amount of time to get through it if it's really made you angry. Some people have got the ability to just move on, and that's great. But what I'm asking you to do is to actually spend a bit of time thinking about this. The hard work in the Lunch and Learn series is not you sitting here listening to me. The hard work for you is actually to go away, take some of this with you and really work on it. This is what happens between the sessions. And what I'm doing here is giving you a series of questions to get you moving in the right direction. By all means, if you feel comfortable, share it with me. Send me an email and offline and say, well, I answered these 5 questions. This is what I came up with. If that helps you, I'm here to listen. So that might be an exercise you might want to think about, because obviously all of you are here in the Lunch and Learn series for a reason, and we know the topic's conflict. So I'm assuming that in order to change things for you, you need to change. And in order for you to change, you need to be aware of what's happening to you internally. So there's a little bit of work for you that might be interesting. So the bottom line with all of this stuff is be relaxed and alert, not tense and unprepared. So relaxed doesn't mean falling asleep. Alert means in the moment. And if you are relaxed and in the moment, you've got a much better chance of dealing with the conflict properly and appropriately than you would if you were tense and unprepared. So do your homework, don't overdo it because it just makes you more stressed, and take that deep breath so that the amygdala hijack doesn't occur. So remember, the amygdala hijack is a really important part of this. You've got to stop that primitive part of your brain overreacting to a circumstance that you're put in, because it's not doing you any good whatsoever. You know that and I know that, but we often think that it's just the way it is. It's not. It's that gap between stimulus and response. We take the deep breath, gives it momentary opportunity to think rationally about the circumstances that we're in. Now, folks, the homework. What I'd like you to do, obviously, is to practice some of the strategies for reducing stress that we've gone through today. I don't mind what you take up. If you can answer those 5 questions that I've given you. If you go into your learning platform, which I strongly recommend you do, there's some exercises in there for you to actually look at. But I really want to make the point that I'm basically here to, the buzz that I get from doing these things is to feel that if I'm making a difference. So the point that you need to do is to take away and work with something that resonated with you today. So that's what your homework is. Are there any questions that any of you have got before we finish up? Because we're just about done. Anything at all that anyone would like to ask, I'm more than happy to respond to that. We've got a few minutes. While people might be putting fingers to keyboard, let's just look at where we've come from in the Lunch and Learn series. We started off with the 5 approaches to dealing with conflict, and there was a diagnostic that went with that. Last time we met, we talked about the understanding people and their personalities and the relationship between personality and stress. And of course, today we've talked about our emotions and how they impact on our capacity to deal with conflict situations. So next time we come together in 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk about the concept of assertion. And an assertion is critically important in terms of dealing with conflict. Thank you. Jethro has just alerted everyone that there's a really great book called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And Jethro, I've read that. It's an excellent read. You're right. So there's another one, folks. Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. You might like to get hold of that book as well. Jethro highly recommends it. Thank you. That's really useful. So, folks, that's it from me. Thank you, everyone. I hope you found that useful, and we'll finish up there. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. And I hope you do your homework and you get something useful out of it. All the best, everyone. Catch you and see you in a fortnight. Thank you and goodbye.